What do you want to be when you grow up? That is the question that well-intentioned adults often ask unsuspecting children, right? Well, John Lennon of Fab Four fame was once asked that very question, to which he replied, happy. I want to be happy when I grow up. Not the question I think his teachers or parents maybe were expecting or wanted to hear, but it's hard to argue with that. What do you want to be when you grow up? Now, some of you may have known from an early age that you were perhaps going to follow in the footsteps of one of your parents as a doctor or a teacher or some other clear-cut profession. And some of you, as it sometimes happens, where maybe some pressure was put on you or some heavy expectation to almost live out the unfulfilled dreams of your parents, right? That happens to us too sometimes. It's funny, after I talked to my parents when I was in high school and later in college about this desire that I had felt to follow this calling to ordained ministry in the church, I learned from my own father, who was a doctor. All my friends even called him Dr. Landry, growing up. I learned from my own father that early in his life, between like the 8th and 9th grade, he had considered and had a strong desire to go to, in the Roman Catholic Church, what was called a pre-seminary, and had seriously felt a call to the priesthood, which was kind of a awkward moment of realization to realize if my dad had followed those plans, I might not have ever been born, right? Well, I never felt any pressure or unfulfilled dream, pressure from my own father in living out that calling, but it was an interesting story that he told me, with this desire to follow this calling in my own life. Being the younger sibling, I avoided most of the expectation or pressure that I would ever become a doctor or anything like that, and my grades kind of saw to that as well. My older sister, I remember having a little bit of maybe expectation or pressure that she would become a doctor or pharmacist or something, and of course she went into the medical field as a physician's assistant, so pressure off of me for that one. Well, part of the reason I bring this up, this question of what do you want to be when you grow up, is because I wonder how in the world John the Baptist ever came to his vocation in life of being the voice of one crying in the wilderness, wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey. I don't know if that was a prescribed career path in his time. In fact, if you'll remember, John's father was Zechariah, the priest. Zechariah was the one who was stunned to find out his wife Elizabeth had conceived in her old age. And as part of his disbelief, when he was given this vision when he was serving in the temple, he was struck mute. He could not speak because he was so kind of dumbstruck by this news. And when the time came to name the child, they asked him, Zechariah, what do you want to name your boy? Zechariah Jr.? And he writes, his name is John, as the angel declared. His name is John. Well, Zechariah was of the line and lineage of Levi. He was a Levite. The priesthood at that time was not so much a vocation that you discerned a call into as it was part of the family business, right? You were of that tribe and you could serve as a priest in the temple. And so John very well should have and could have been expected to be a priest like Zechariah, his father. And yet, after all these stories around the time of those annunciations, we fast forward and we discover John out in the wilderness, far away from the establishment, proclaiming, "Make straight in the highway, a desert for, make straight the way of the Lord." There were groups who kind of lived out in the wilderness, who were very rigorous in their spirituality. The Essenes were one of these groups, and some scholars think that John could have been part of one of those groups. But he emerges as the kind of prophet that the people recognized. All the people were going out to a very inconvenient place to hear his message, to hear his preaching, and to be baptized. And John, of course, embodies, as he quotes the messenger, the prophet, Isaiah. You'll notice throughout our readings today, Isaiah pops up several times. We heard it in the opening collect. Help us to heed the warning of your messengers, the prophets. And all throughout Advent, we are given these readings from the book of Isaiah, the heavy hitter prophet. And Isaiah is the Old Testament book most often quoted in the New Testament. Well, it pops up too in Paul's letter to the Romans as he quotes the prophet Isaiah, talking about this tree of Jesse, or in Isaiah, the stump of Jesse, from which a root shall spring up. Recalling a type of golden era in the life of Israel under King David. And it's interesting to think, too, that David was not descended from kings. David's father was Jesse, the stump of Jesse, and David was anointed king. And Isaiah speaks of this one who will follow in the lineage of David, one who doesn't necessarily descend from some sort of seat of political power, but who God raises up to free his people. Well, the prophet Isaiah goes on to share a gorgeous vision that has inspired many artists and musicians, inspiring this idea of the peaceable kingdom. The peaceable kingdom, where the lion shall lie down with the lamb, and all of God's creation is restored to its original order, like in the Garden of Eden, where no one shall hurt or destroy on God's holy mountain. You may have noticed, too, that in a couple of the readings, both in Isaiah and then even this little mention from John the Baptist, that there are some mention of some rather scary snakes. Did you pick up on this? There's the adder and the viper. John calls the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming out, "You brood of vipers." Not a great way to win friends and influence people. But in Isaiah's vision of creation restored, these creations of God will be peaceable among one another. I may have shared this with some of you before, but before I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, one of my first jobs was in a pet store. First in high school and then later on in college. Matter of fact, if you ever went to the pet supermarket up in Vestavia sometime around the year 2000, I may have been your cashier. Well, I learned about all sorts of creatures at the pet store, which fish had to be separated from one another so they didn't fight or devour each other. I learned what reptiles and rodents had to be separated, at least until it was time to eat. And I learned, too, which animals were approachable and which ones required a great deal of caution. I remember there were some birds you could go straight up to and pick them up, and they were friendly. And other birds, you would stick your finger in there, and they would take your finger off. I learned not to fear so much the reptiles and such who, if they bit, it wasn't so bad when they were little. But my greatest fear of all were the precious little dwarf hamsters with their dagger teeth, which would draw blood. Well, all of these creatures in this vision of Isaiah are restored to this order of peace and harmony and coexistence. And I wonder how that question would begin to change. What do you want to be when you grow up? If we were to shift from answering that question from what do you want to do to how do you want to be? How do you want to exist? How do you want to go about your being in the world? Now, this becomes a question not only for students, but also a question for those of us who are maybe well into professions or vocations or even retired. The deeper question becomes not just what do we do, but how are we going to be? How are we going to exist in this hope of a peaceable kingdom? Now, one of the ways I have begun to ponder this is this deep desire in this vision of a peaceable kingdom to be at home, to be comfortable in my own skin, to be confident and comfortable in who God has created me to be without having to live up to the demands or expectations of others. A way to be at peace with myself and allow others to be at peace with themselves. It's a way of maturing in the world to discover how I can be truly myself without in any way harming the rest of God's creation. That's the vision of the peaceable kingdom. So as we hear these lessons, the message from Isaiah, as we hear the cry of the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, I encourage you, whatever your age, to ponder this question, not only what do you want to be when you grow up, but how do you want to be in God's peaceable kingdom? As you and I reflect on that question and live into that way of being, we will be living in to the Apostle Paul's prayer that the God of all hope may fill us with all peace in the joy of this peaceable kingdom.